Hi guys, welcome back to Too Cool for Middle School. Today we're going to be going through my entire teacher lesson planner from last year. I taught 3 sections of 6th grade ancient civilizations. I taught one group of kids, but it was 2 blocks of 6th grade English, and then 1 section of 8th grade English. So it's going to be a little bit confusing as we go through my lesson planner because we're looking at all 3 of those courses, and I always dedicated 2 columns to my 6th grade English class because I had them for twice as long as all of my other classes. That's just how we do 6th grade English at the school where I work. So that'll be the basic setup. I'm going to try and go through fairly quickly because this turns into a really long video. I have one from last year that I can link right here if you want to look at my 6th grade English and 6th grade Read 180 lessons. You'll see some differences to this year with my 6th grade English classes. These are not like detailed lesson plans by any means. This is just like notes that I jotted down to myself to remember what was going on. Usually I would write things down a couple days in advance just to plan things out for myself, and then I had more detailed lesson plans online and on Google Classroom and stuff. So this is just like my teacher thought process. Okay, I'll stop rambling. Let's take a look. This is my little desk at home that I'm usually covering in most of my videos. This is my lesson planner. I just kept this at school. I didn't take this back and forth with me. This was just for keeping track of my lessons and my calendars and things like that at school. This is by Purple Trail Planner. They customized this one for me and I love how it turned out. It even says Too Cool for Middle School on the back. You can customize your planners with Purple Trail however you like, and I love them. I used one very similar to this last year. I just taped a picture on the inside of me and my family just for inspiration. This is actually from Erin Condren, but it fit inside this Purple Trail planner. And anytime I messed up my lesson plans and needed to completely cover them, I would use this. It gives you a list of holidays and an overview calendar. This one started in August. This was the week that we started school. Our first day was on a Thursday, and so I started all of my classes with circles. There were no assigned seats or anything like that. We just got to know each other through circles. And then on the second day, that's when we went over our syllabus, and I go through a PowerPoint, which I will share soon. Actually, I'll go over all of that again for this year, and I handed out name tags and things. So I love that. With this planner, I was able to label each column. So I have 1 for History 6. Again, I did 2 for English 6, English 8, anything I needed to get done on my prep, any meetings that we had after school, and then just other to-dos. So this is the first full week of school. I have my kids do a syllabus scavenger hunt. I also go through an email etiquette lesson with them, and I get them started on vocabulary pretty much right away. I also started the year off by doing 5-a-days, which you can find on Teachers Pay Teachers. It was actually a little tough to keep it going through the whole year, but we did do that at the beginning. With my history classes, I started off by going into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I will do that again this year, and I have one video about how I lesson plan for that, and I'll probably do more this year. For my English classes, we used the collections curriculum, and so that's what these stories are from. The second full week of school, we were still doing Universal Declaration of Human Rights. My kids have 1-to-1 Chromebooks, so I got them set up on Newsella and vocabulary. I also really like to use Flipgrids, and I like to introduce a lot of the technology that we're going to be using at the beginning of the school year, just so that they get a chance to practice with it, and then I can just throw it at them anytime I need them to use it later on. We moved into Ancient Humans pretty quickly. My 6th graders were doing a unit on hurricanes and natural disasters from the collections curriculum, and my 8th graders were doing a unit on identity, also from the collections curriculum. I also had them take the SRI test to get a sense of their reading levels. And then we moved into September, and I just wrote down some notes from meetings there. I appreciate the note-taking section. This was for 6th grade. We were doing the dealing with disaster unit, and then I knew we were gonna move into a wonder unit quickly after that, so I just wrote down a few ideas. I coach volleyball, so I pretty much used the calendar section just for volleyball stuff. I guess this was Labor Day. With my history classes, we were still doing early humans. I found a cool readers theater lesson on Teachers Pay Teachers. On Thursdays, we always do circles. We did that for most of the year. And that was when I would teach digital citizenship lessons. And so I used Internet Awesome from Google. My English students were still working on their disaster unit, and we dove into a little bit of geo-myths. And then my 8th graders were still reading through stories in the identity collection in their units. And then I also like to use Verso quite a bit, so we tested that out with them. On September 11th, I have a lesson that I do almost every year. I also have a video on that if you want to check it out. YouTube like flagged it as inappropriate, so I hope that it's still there. It's not inappropriate, it's just that it's about 9/11. We were still working on Early Man. We did I Am poems for Early Man in my history classes. And again, we did circles and like digital citizenship stuff on Thursdays. And then we did a Constitution Day flip grid here. 6th graders were still doing stories from that same collection. The Banana Tree is a good story. And then the 8th graders were still doing stories from that collection as well. And I do have a few videos about these collections and how I use them, and I'm trying to make more videos about those as well. Here is where I finally got into color coding things. Makes it so much more fun for me. In my history classes, we started getting into like hunter-gatherers and the agricultural revolution, and again, internet safety here on Thursdays. For my 6th graders, we were still working on hurricanes. Oh my gosh, this story, There Will Come Soft Rains, is amazing. I actually really enjoyed this unit. It was unit 3, but we jumped to it because there were hurricanes happening at the time when we were studying this, and so we wanted to be able to connect it to real life. And my 8th graders were still working on the identity collection, and I really love that one as well. I got a little bit more into my color coding here. We continued with our agricultural revolution and early man. I think next year I'm going to try and do this stuff a little bit quicker because it feels like we spent a long time on that. We were still in the disaster unit here. I remember this Titanic article was really interesting. We also did a Google Hangout with my friend Miss Tierney because her students had recently experienced a hurricane and we wanted to talk to them about what that was like. I also incorporated some blogs and some YouTube videos that I found for my 8th graders. We had a really good time with this unit. And then on Fridays, I was trying to do like silent reading and literature responses. I'm gonna try and do a little bit more of that this year as well. We didn't always stick with everything that we started. Sometimes it's kind of hard to do that with such a short amount of time. So getting into October, in my history classes, we were looking at the geography of the Middle East and kind of going into longitude and latitude and just geography lessons in general. This day, we had no school. We had a staff development for the whole day. My 6th graders were still on the same unit, but they moved on to the performance assessment, and then we started working with text features. I think this was from vocabulary. And then this week, the 8th graders were on a field trip that I didn't go on since I only have one class of 8th graders. I might get to go next year. My history students were doing Google Hangouts, more geography, more digital citizenship lessons, and then we started getting into like the Sumerians and the Akkadians and Babylonians and all of that. My English students finished up an assessment and then moved on to doing our Wonder unit. I wanted to finish Wonder in time to take them on a field trip to go see the movie, so we took the entire 6th grade class to go see the movie. We walked to the movie theater, but we wanted to really understand the story before we did that. And then my 8th graders were still working on the same unit that we had started at the beginning of the year, but it is a really good unit. And again, I do have a YouTube video about how I taught that. History kids were going into empires, more geography. They wrote skits about the Mesopotamian empires, and those were really, really fun. My English kids were starting to go through Wonder, and we were really looking at like the quotes in the beginning of each chapter, like the lyrics or lines from poems that were supposed to match up with different characters of the story and why they chose those. My 8th graders finally finished up that first collection, and then we moved on to a thrill of horror unit, which was also really fun. They really enjoyed it. We started with the Telltale Heart. Since this was October, we were kind of leading up to Halloween with that. The history students were working on their skits still. They got really into them, so I let them work on them for a while. We did cuneiform tablets with actual clay. That was really fun. This was the first year that I used the collection curriculum, and so I think I had just found out that they offered literature chests, so we just tried those out. We're moving on to Jack's chapter and really trying to look at why the author included things like the Little Prince the way she did. The 8th graders spent all of this week working on the Telltale Heart, and they really loved working on that story. Then we got into November. I didn't take very many notes. This was the day that Wonder came out, and we took a walking field trip over to the theater and got to see it. With my history students, we were doing like Epic of Gilgamesh and Hammurabi. This Hammurabi's code DBQ is wonderful. This blended quotes station activity was really great. This is from my friend Emily over at Read It, Write It, Learn It. That's actually how I met her, because I started talking about it on Instagram all the time, and then she messaged me back. We did a little bit for Halloween, like zombie figurative language, but then we got right back into more Wonder stuff. My 8th graders were writing their own scary stories. We do something called rainbow editing that I think I might have a blog post on. I can't remember. I'll have to do a video or a blog post about that. And then we moved on to Monkey's Paw, which is another really cool story, and we did DVD cover projects on it, which I know are on Instagram and maybe on my blog. I can't remember. History students were going through the Assyrian siege, more Hammurabi's code. English 6 was working on illusions and what the beginning of each chapter really meant for each character, and I split them up into groups and had them working on those. We also did something for Veterans Day. The 8th graders were still doing their DVD cover projects. This was when we did our mystery hangout with Christina, and I just made a video about how to do mystery hangouts if you ever want to check that out. Here's when we started ancient Egypt and started looking at African geography. Here we were still looking at Wonder, but incorporating things like a Lizzie Vasquez YouTube video. They really enjoyed that one. Oh, this was our field trip day, so I was out for most of those periods. Their DVD projects were due for the 8th graders, and they started reading The Outsider. That one is like a really complex text, and we started looking at Frankenstein. I must have spilled water on this page. I don't know why I crossed out all of that, but we were getting into Egyptian history here. And then we started a new collection, collection 5, with my 6th graders. And I remember thinking that this one would be really good, but it actually wasn't good to do it before collection 4. I really should have done those in order. So it was okay, it just didn't make as much sense as it would have if I had done them in order. The 8th graders were still working on horror stories, and we did some Cahoots and talked more about Telltale Heart and Monkey's Paw. After that, we moved on to our Anne Frank unit, and so that's why we started talking about the Holocaust and World War II. Then we got into December, and here's where I started trying to keep track of like, okay, what am I doing with each course here? We had quite a few things coming up. It was kind of a busy month. History students were still doing ancient Egypt. English students were still reading through that collection 4. It was decent. It looks a little sparse here. And then my 8th graders were just diving into all of the Anne Frank kind of background information before we got started on the actual text. This was a great DBQ to do with my history students. They got really into this. This can be found on the Sheg website, Reading Like a Historian. The 6th graders got a little bit into poetry and metaphor and things like that this week. and my 8th graders were continuing to work on Diary of a Young Girl. Here we moved on to the ancient Hebrews, and we even made our own latkes and had a Hanukkah celebration, and I have a vlog about that if you want to see my kids doing that. That was really, really fun. 6th graders were kind of wrapping up the unit that we had started, and then the 8th graders were doing a little bit of that as well. We did a lot of like figurative language and just some fun stuff right before the end of the semester and our break for Christmas. This was December 22nd. Moving into January, I started trying to just write down some of the things that I wanted to cover in each course. It is tough to have so many courses, as you can see. Just planning for all of them is a little time consuming. So when we came back with my history students, we started talking about our winter breaks a little bit, and then we moved on to the geography of India. My English students were writing a paper, and then we did a unit on just reading any book that they wanted to read. So we did literary analysis on any book with these mini flip books. And I teach the Jane Schaefer method of writing paragraphs, and so I should have gotten into this earlier, but we didn't start it till second semester. We also set some goals for the year and started working on blending quotes into our writing as we continued with the Anne Frank unit. This was a really long unit. Here we were still on ancient India and started looking at ancient artifacts and Hinduism. My English students were working on writing about the books that they had chosen, and the 8th graders were still doing Diary of Anne Frank and getting into characters and conflicts, and we watched some of the movie on Netflix. For ancient India, we were doing Hinduism and Buddhism. Oh, we also did this really great unit where they made a comic about a Hindu superhero, like a Hindu god. We used storyboard that in order to do these. That was a really cool platform. The 6th graders were just doing more literary analysis, theme and plot, and working on their flip books. I also have those on Instagram if you kind of scroll back a ways and look at the school year. 8th graders were still on Anne Frank. This was quite a long unit. We read the entire text. I think next year I won't, so that we can get to some other things. This is like a career day lesson. We did like stations for a lot of our assessments. I did a lot of like group assessments last year. That was kind of fun. On World Hijab Day, we watched some videos and had some really good conversation. With my English students, I moved on to a civil rights unit that I purchased from Teachers Pay Teachers a couple years ago. I also have a YouTube video about that if you want to know more about it. It was great. We talked about Schomburg, Sylvia Mendez, and a lot about the children of the civil rights movement. My 8th graders were working on active and passive voice. That was something they struggled with a lot last year, and they did these beautiful one-pagers about the Anne Frank story, and those are on my blog. Those ended up really, really nice. Moving into February, here were some of the things I was trying to focus on. They finished up their comics and then moved on to a DBQ about Ashoka. This was also an amazing unit. They really did a great job with that. 6th graders were still working on their civil rights unit. They did an amazing job with that as well. And then with my 8th graders, I ended the Anne Frank unit with a Swing Kids unit and a discussion about privilege that I got from Teaching Tolerance. I want to put the Swing Kids lesson on Teachers Pay Teachers, but first I need to go through the whole movie and like find all the places where there are inappropriate things and like write warnings, because there is a lot of cussing and stuff, and I just wouldn't want a teacher to just like turn it on and not know that that was coming. So one of these days I'll get that all put together. We were still working on our DBQs here, and then we started getting into ancient China, and we had a Chinese New Year celebration that was so fun with my students who are mostly Chinese and were able to teach me so much about that. With my English students, we were still on our civil rights unit and then got into a few lessons out of the textbook as well, just to round out the week. My 8th graders were doing Swing Kids, and we did a few things for Valentine's Day. I love using both vocabulary and crash course for teaching history, and this is as we were getting into ancient China. The 6th graders were doing a unit on like using your voice. This is one of the units within the collections curriculum. This one was decent. I feel like I could teach it better next year, but I'm not even teaching this course next year. I'm only doing these two. So these are the two I'm really trying to pay attention to as I go through my old lessons. Here we started also focusing on just some literary analysis and doing papers and works cited pages. This camera is really heavy, my hands are starting to hurt. We also entered the week in wrap. I have another video about that as well. That was one of my students' favorite things. We also did a really cool Silk Road Stations lesson, and I have another video about that as well. And you'll notice on Thursdays we're still doing circles, and sometimes we talk about things like the 7 habits. For some reason I wrote 5 habits. And with my English classes we would just continue our regular lessons but in a circle format. My English students were reading a few more stories and using our curriculum from collections, and the 8th graders worked really hard on trying to figure out how to do works cited pages, and I think they learned a lot from that, and when they have to do them in high school I think they will be prepared. Moving into March, here were some of the things that I wanted to make sure to get to. This was another busy month. History students were still on ancient China. We did parody videos about the different Chinese philosophies and put those on Flipgrid. Those were really cool. English class, still working on their using their voice lesson. We also worked with Lucid Press and Canva. I like both of those sites. 8th graders did a structured academic controversy about banned books. That was really fun, and I do have a blog post on that. Here we did a Qin Dynasty DBQ, which was great. And the 6th graders get to do a cool thing called Science Day, so this was a little bit different schedule than usual. And then with my 6th graders, I used curriculum from the Mikvah Challenge. It's Project Soapbox. And they each wrote 30-second speeches about something that they were passionate about, so we spent quite a while working on those. My 8th graders did a little bit of literary analysis, looking at mood, symbolism, characterization, and things like that. Here we wrote a travel journal about being on the Silk Road, and that was also part of the DBQ. So this was a fun project. 6th graders were still working on speech writing and things like logical and emotional appeals. They practiced on Flipgrid and gave each other feedback. 8th graders were still doing literary analysis. We used a lot of curriculum from Doc Cop Teaching. Oh, this was one of the signs from my classroom. History students were still working on their journals, and then we got into ancient Greece, and it's been a long tradition at our school where we do something called Greek Day, which I will write a blog post about soon. I have it halfway done. The English students were still working on their speeches, and we also went to the book fair, and then when it was the anniversary of the United States Virgin Islands becoming part of the United States, I did a Rothschild Francis lesson with my English students. I have this on Teachers Pay Teachers as well. So we spent a little bit more time on Rothschild Francis. That was really fun. Getting into April, these were the things that we were trying to get to. Another busy month. We were doing ancient Greece and geography. Here we got into a fake news unit, which I would actually love to talk to you more about and do a video or a blog post more about how we do this. This is really great. 8th graders were still doing some Rothschild Francis stuff in primary source documents. And then we moved on to a new collection in their curriculum called March Toward Freedom. We looked at ancient forms of government, the Odyssey, we made triremes, looked at Athens versus Sparta. After our fake news unit, we got into some poetry and some Greek myth. The 8th graders unit had a lot of Civil War content, and this lined up with what the history teachers were doing at the same time, so that was really good. We continued preparing for Greek Day, and each class was a different city-state, and this was a whole day. This was really fun. I ran an Olympic obstacle course. And then in my English classes, we were also kind of supporting Greek myths and supporting what they were doing in history. We continued with our Civil War documents in 8th grade, and then we also started an immigration project as we got into the month of May. And here were a few things I was trying to get to. This was the month of testing. So here we were still working on ancient Greece. We were preparing for testing here, and then also kind of preparing for testing / getting ready for their immigration projects. This was the week of testing, so it's a little bit crazy looking, but I like to do a lesson on the 16 personalities with my students during this time because it's still academic, but it gives them a little bit of break from like the part of their brain that they're using to test. So that was really fun. Still working on ancient Greece here. And here we got into my favorite unit to teach, Farewell to Manzanar, and I have a whole video about that as well. Still doing the same collection for 8th grade. Here we got into ancient Rome and the fall of ancient Rome. This is all Farewell to Manzanar. And here we were working on immigration presentations where they had to interview an immigrant and do a presentation on what they learned about immigration. Almost all of them are immigrants themselves or sons or daughters of immigrants. This was a bit of a crazy week. I think I was out a lot and it was toward the end of the year, so I didn't even write down very much for this month, or for that week, I guess. And then going into June, this is the end of the year, and I didn't write very much down for that either. So that's my whole year at a glance. I am like sweating just talking about it and stressed just going through it, but I hope that this was helpful to you in some way. And thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you with another one of these videos next year. Bye!